I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, standing at my neighbor Emily's door at midnight, with tears streaming down her face and a confession that shook me to my core. Her husband wasn't just gone for the night. He was with someone else. And what happened next? I never could have imagined. Emily and Daniel were the new couple on the block, the kind you couldn't help but notice. Emily, with her warm smile and soft laughter, had a way of making everyone feel at ease. She was the type of neighbor who brought cookies during the holidays and stopped to chat on the sidewalk. Daniel, her husband, was polite but reserved, a man of few words who seemed content to let Emily be the face of their relationship. Together, they appeared picture-perfect, like a couple pulled straight out of a romance movie. I had only recently moved into the building myself, and hadn't had much interaction with them beyond casual greetings in the hallway. My life had been a blur of work and solitude, with little time for anything else. But even in our brief encounters, it was clear how devoted Emily was to Daniel. She spoke of him often, her eyes lighting up as she recounted their adventures or his quirks that made her laugh. My own days were a stark contrast to theirs, or at least, to what I imagined their lives were like. I spent my evenings alone, surrounded by silence, occasionally punctuated by the faint hum of the television. It was during one of those lonely nights that I returned late from a colleague's birthday party, feeling drained and eager to collapse into bed. As I approached the entrance to our building, the streets were eerily quiet. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, and the air carried a weight that made me shiver. That's when I saw her, Emily, sitting alone on the bench near the entrance, her head bowed and her figure slumped. It was a sight that felt entirely out of place for someone as cheerful as her. Her disheveled appearance and glassy eyes told a story without words, one of exhaustion and sadness that immediately stirred my concern. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach her, but the fragility of her frame and the faint tremble in her hands compelled me to act. Little did I know, stepping closer to Emily that night would set into motion a chain of events that would blur the lines of right and wrong in ways I couldn't have anticipated. That night, as I helped Emily to her apartment, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. Her words replayed in my mind. He's with someone else tonight. They were spoken in a shaky voice, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. The Emily I had seen laughing and glowing with joy was now a shadow of herself, drowning in despair. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice subtle changes in her demeanor. The once cheerful neighbor I'd occasionally exchanged pleasantries with now seemed distant. Whenever I passed her in the hallway, her gaze remained fixed on the floor, and her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. Daniel, on the other hand, was conspicuously absent. I hadn't seen him around the building at all, and Emily's apartment remained eerily quiet. I told myself it wasn't my business. But something about the way she had clung to me that night, her tear-filled eyes pleading for someone to stay, stuck with me. I had always prided myself on keeping a respectful distance from others' personal lives, yet Emily's pain was hard to ignore. It was like a low hum in the back of my mind, always there, gnawing at my thoughts. The next time I saw her, she was returning from the grocery store. Her arms were laden with bags, and she struggled to balance them while unlocking her door. Without thinking, I offered to help. She hesitated for a moment before nodding silently. As I placed the bags on her kitchen counter, I caught sight of something that deepened the knot in my stomach, a picture frame turned face down on the table. Its dusty edges suggested it had been like that for a while. "Emily," I began, my voice cautious, "are you okay? You don't seem like yourself lately." Her eyes darted to the floor, and she fiddled with the hem of her sweater. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But the crack in her tone betrayed her words. Before I could press further, she thanked me quickly and ushered me out, leaving me with more questions than answers. Days turned into weeks, and the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The faint sounds of muffled arguments from her apartment at night, the hurried footsteps of someone leaving in the early hours, and her increasingly withdrawn behavior painted a picture of a life unraveling. My mind wandered to Daniel's absence and her cryptic words that night. Was he really with someone else? Had she confronted him about it? Or was she trapped in a cycle of denial, unable to face the truth? The tension between them seemed to seep into the very walls of the building, a palpable unease that I couldn't ignore. I started noticing how Emily's eyes lingered on her phone during our brief encounters, her fingers nervously tapping on the screen. She seemed to be waiting for a message, a call, or maybe a sign that things weren't as broken as they seemed. I found myself drawn into her world, though I knew I shouldn't be. The boundary between concern and intrusion felt razor-thin, but my growing suspicion about Daniel and the increasing cracks in Emily's composure made it impossible to look away. Every interaction with her felt like peeling back another layer of a painful secret she was desperately trying to keep hidden. What I didn't realize then was that this growing tension wasn't just about Emily and Daniel's fractured relationship. It was pulling me into its orbit, creating a tangled web that would soon become impossible to escape. It started with small moments that felt innocent at first, but carried a weight I couldn't quite understand. Emily would linger in the hallway after our conversations, her eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance, for someone who saw her. I'd catch her glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking, and when our eyes met, she'd quickly turn away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I told myself it was nothing, just the vulnerability of someone going through a hard time. But as the days passed, those moments grew more frequent, and the air between us seemed to thrum with something unspoken. One evening, as I returned home, I found her sitting on the same bench outside our building where I had first seen her that fateful night. She looked up as I approached, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I hesitated but nodded, sitting down beside her. The cool night air wrapped around us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she began to talk, about Daniel, about the nights he didn't come home, about the woman she suspected he was seeing. Her words were halting, as if it hurt to admit them out loud. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and I fought the urge to reach out and steady them. "I don't know what I did wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "I tried to be everything he needed, but it wasn't enough." Her vulnerability was like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she deserved better, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, I placed a hand on hers, a simple gesture meant to comfort. She looked down at our hands, her breath hitching, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "James," she said, her voice barely audible, "I feel like I'm losing myself." I didn't know how to respond. The lines between right and wrong blurred as I sat there, feeling the warmth of her hand beneath mine. When she leaned her head on my shoulder, I froze. It was such a small, innocent act, but it sent a ripple through me, a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. That night marked a shift. Emily began seeking me out more often, knocking on my door to borrow something trivial, lingering in the doorway as if reluctant to leave. Her laughter, soft and hesitant, started to return in my presence, and I found myself drawn to her in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was in the way her eyes lit up when I made a joke, the way she leaned just a little too close when we talked. Every interaction felt charged, like standing too close to a fire. The breaking point came on a quiet evening. She had knocked on my door again, this time with a bottle of wine in hand. "I thought you might want some company," she said, her smile tentative. We sat on my couch, talking about everything and nothing. The wine loosened our words, made them flow more freely, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed at ease. But as the night wore on, the space between us grew smaller, the pauses in our conversation longer. When she reached out to brush an imaginary speck of lint from my shirt, her fingers lingered, and I felt my resolve begin to crack. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said, her voice trembling. Her eyes searched mine, and in that moment, the walls I had built around myself crumbled. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, that she needed comfort, and I was simply offering it. But when her hand slid to my cheek and she leaned closer, I didn't stop her. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if testing the waters, but it quickly deepened. Her hands tangled in my hair, and mine found their way to her waist. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but the intensity of the moment drowned them out. It was as if all the pain and longing she had been carrying had poured into that kiss, and I was powerless against it. When we finally broke apart, her eyes were wide with a mix of surprise and something else, something darker, more vulnerable. "I shouldn't have," she began, but I silenced her with a shake of my head. "It's okay," I said, though I knew it wasn't. The rest of the night passed in a haze, a blur of emotions too tangled to untangle. We crossed a line neither of us could uncross, and as I lay awake in the darkness beside her, guilt gnawed at me. Yet beneath the guilt there was something else, a dangerous, forbidden spark I couldn't ignore. The morning light streamed through the curtains, its warmth doing little to thaw the cold weight of guilt settling over me. I woke to find Emily still asleep beside me, her face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that what had happened wasn't a mistake, that in some strange way, I had given her the solace she desperately needed. But as the events of the night came rushing back, reality struck like a thunderclap. I had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. I dressed quietly, careful not to wake her, and slipped out of her apartment. The hallway felt oppressive, the silence deafening as I made my way back to my own space. Every step felt heavier than the last, my mind replaying the kiss, the touch, the choices I had made. The following days were a whirlwind of avoidance. Emily and I didn't cross paths, though I could feel the weight of her presence just behind her door every time I walked by. The tension was suffocating, and I found myself consumed by a mix of emotions, guilt, regret, and something I dared not name. I tried to distract myself with work, with anything that could keep my mind from wandering back to her, but it was futile. And then the storm broke. It was late one evening when I heard a loud knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat as I opened it to find Daniel standing there. His face was a mask of restrained fury, his eyes dark and searching. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where's Emily?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice betraying the unease coursing through me. "She's been distant," he continued, stepping closer. "And I know she's been spending time with you." My stomach dropped. The air between us crackled with tension, and for a moment, I considered denying everything. But the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't believe it. He already suspected something, and my silence only confirmed his worst fears. "I'm just trying to help her," I said, my voice trembling. "She's been struggling, Daniel. She needs support." He let out a bitter laugh, the sound cold and hollow. "Support," he echoed. "Is that what you call it?" Before I could respond, the door to Emily's apartment swung open. She stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" He turned to her, his expression hardening. "I'm trying to figure out what's going on," he snapped. "Because something clearly is." Emily's gaze flickered to me, and I saw the panic in her eyes. "Nothing's going on," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. The tension in the hallway was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations. I wanted to say something, anything to defuse the situation, but the words wouldn't come. And then, as if sensing the truth, Daniel's face twisted with realization. "You," he said, his voice low and venomous. "It's you, isn't it?" Emily's silence was answer enough. The look of betrayal on Daniel's face was devastating, and for a moment, I felt a pang of pity for him despite everything. He turned to her, his voice rising with anger. "How could you do this to me?" Tears streamed down Emily's face as she tried to explain, her words coming out in broken fragments. "I was lonely," she said, her voice shaking. "You were never here, Daniel. You left me alone when I needed you the most." "That's your excuse?" he shot back, his voice filled with disbelief. "You threw everything away because you were lonely?" As their argument escalated, I stood frozen, caught in the middle of the storm. The guilt I had been carrying now threatened to crush me entirely. I had been complicit in this, and now the consequences were unfolding before my eyes. And then, Daniel turned to me, his eyes blazing. "You're no better," he spat. "You knew she was married, and you still went after her." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was right, I had no defense, no justification for what I had done. All I could do was stand there, silent and ashamed, as the reality of my actions came crashing down. Emily's sobs filled the hallway, and Daniel's anger gave way to something else, an overwhelming sadness that seemed to drain the fight out of him. "I loved you, Emily," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I thought we had something worth fighting for." Her response was a whisper, barely audible. "I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands, and I was left standing there, unsure of what to do. When I finally found the courage to kneel beside her, she looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes filled with despair. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said, her voice hollow. "Neither did I. But it had, and there was no undoing the damage we had caused." The weight of that truth settled heavily over both of us, and for the first time, I realized just how far we had fallen. The days after Daniel's departure felt like walking through a graveyard, silent, heavy, and filled with the ghosts of choices I wished I could undo. Emily's apartment was dark and lifeless, the curtains drawn, and no sound escaped through the walls. It was as if she had retreated from the world entirely, and a part of me couldn't blame her. The weight of what we'd done was unbearable. I avoided her door, her presence, and anything that might force us to confront the aftermath of that night. But guilt followed me like a shadow, creeping into every corner of my life. I replayed the argument in my mind over and over, Daniel's devastated face haunting my thoughts. I had been so caught up in my desire to help Emily, in the spark of connection we had shared, that I hadn't stopped to consider the wreckage we were leaving in our wake. One evening, I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart sank as I opened it to find Emily standing there, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now hollow and rimmed with red. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice fragile. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, charged with unspoken emotions. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I've lost everything. Daniel, my marriage, and now, I've dragged you into it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't wrong. We had crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. But hearing her say it out loud made the weight of it even heavier. "I'm just as much to blame," I admitted. "I should have stopped it before it got this far." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I don't regret turning to you, James," she said softly. "You were there when no one else was. But I do regret hurting him. I never wanted things to end this way." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could do was nod. The truth was, I didn't regret being there for her either. But I couldn't deny the pain we had caused, both to Daniel and to ourselves. Over the following weeks, Emily began to pick up the pieces of her life. She reached out to friends she had grown distant from, started therapy, and even began looking for a new apartment. She told me she needed a fresh start, away from the memories that haunted her. I supported her decision, though the thought of her leaving left a strange emptiness in my chest. As for Daniel, he didn't return. A few neighbors whispered about seeing him pack his things and leave town, but no one knew for sure where he had gone. I imagined he needed distance, space to heal from the betrayal that had torn his world apart. I couldn't blame him for that. The hardest part was the shift in my relationship with Emily. We no longer shared the easy camaraderie we once had. Our interactions were strained, weighed down by the unspoken understanding that we had crossed a boundary we couldn't uncross. The spark that had once drawn us together now felt like a dangerous flame we had to keep extinguished. One evening, as she prepared to leave for good, she stopped by my apartment to say goodbye. She stood in the doorway, a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "For everything." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Take care of yourself, Emily." She lingered for a moment, as if searching for the right words, then turned and walked away. Watching her go, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Relief that we were finally putting distance between us, but loss for what could have been, if only the circumstances had been different. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The building felt quieter without Emily's presence, and I threw myself into work, trying to bury the lingering guilt. But every so often I'd catch myself thinking about her, wondering if she was okay, if she had found the peace she was searching for. One thing was certain. The events of those weeks had left a mark on me, a scar that would take time to heal. I had learned the hard way that moments of weakness, no matter how well-intentioned, could have far-reaching consequences. And while I couldn't change the past, I could try to make better choices in the future. The fallout of our actions had been devastating, but it had also been a wake-up call, a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the heavy price of betrayal. I hoped Emily would find a way to rebuild her life, and I resolved to do the same. In the quiet weeks after Emily left, the weight of everything that had happened lingered like an unshakable shadow. I spent hours reflecting on the choices we'd made, the lines we'd crossed, and the lives that had been affected by it all. The guilt was a constant presence, but so too was the realization that this had been a turning point. Not just for Emily, but for me as well. For Emily, the decision to leave was about more than escaping her apartment or the memories of Daniel. It was about reclaiming herself. She had been trapped in a cycle of loneliness and neglect for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. Her goodbye was bittersweet, but it was also hopeful. She was stepping into the unknown, into a life where she could rebuild on her own terms. As for Daniel, his departure was quieter, more subdued. I never saw him again, but I often thought about him. He had been betrayed in a way no one deserved, and I could only hope that he would find healing somewhere down the road. His absence was a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastation that came when it was broken. For me, the fallout had been a lesson in boundaries, in understanding the consequences of my actions. I had set out to help someone, to be a source of comfort, but I hadn't considered the cost, not just to others, but to myself. My involvement with Emily had left scars, and though time might fade them, they would never fully disappear. I began to take small steps toward self-improvement. I reached out to friends I had grown distant from, started going to therapy, and worked on understanding why I had allowed myself to get so deeply entangled in Emily's life. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The experience had taught me that while it was natural to want to help someone in pain, it was equally important to recognize my limits and respect the boundaries that should never be crossed. One evening, months after Emily's departure, I found myself sitting on the same bench where I had first found her that night. The air was crisp, the city alive with the hum of distant traffic. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity. I thought about everything that had happened, not with regret, but with acceptance. The choices I'd made couldn't be undone, but they could guide me moving forward. The biggest takeaway was a simple yet profound realization. Love, comfort, and connection should never come at the expense of integrity. The allure of crossing forbidden lines, of seeking solace in the wrong places, was powerful, but it was never worth the damage it left in its wake. Trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered and painfully rebuilt, and I had learned the hard way how important it was to protect it. Emily's absence left a void, but it also left a lesson. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to step back, to allow them the space to heal and grow on their own. And sometimes, the most important person to help is yourself. As I stood to leave the bench that night, I felt a sense of closure. The story of Emily and Daniel, of the choices we had made, was one I would carry with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the kind of person I wanted to be. Life was full of temptations and missteps, but it was also full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to do better. And that's what I intended to do. If you were in James's position, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this complicated story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking and thought-provoking tales. Next time, we'll dive into another story of forbidden choices and unexpected consequences. You won't want to miss it.